Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you, Tricia, for that lovely introduction. I remember that course and doing over Latin in the Hungarian pastry shop very vividly. It was a wonderful group of people. I'm still in touch with a number of you. And thank you, everybody involved, for giving me the chance to give this lecture. I have been elected for next year president of the American Historical Association. To those who don't know, let me say that this is not the kind of distinction anybody brags about. It means that for the year in which I am president, I will have a large bullseye on my back at which deans dissatisfied with their history departments, graduate students who can't find jobs, and many other people will be launching darts, not to mention blog posts, indignant emails, and denunciations of my public statements. In that capacity, I'll be talking about and defending the humanities in all kinds of contexts. We go to the Hill every spring on Humanities Day, and we try to lobby for the humanities. We speak to donors, we speak to foundations, we speak to backers. And so it's incredibly helpful to me, and I'm extremely grateful to have the chance to try to lay out in a little more systematic way than we normally can what seem to me the main features in the situation of the humanities now and why that situation is so difficult. During the 2004 presidential campaign, a tired advisor to John Kerry in an inadvised moment said something he regretted to a microphone. It's really hard to think when you're getting the shit kicked out of you every day. I'm sorry to say that that more or less describes the situation of the humanities in the United States and also in Britain and much of the rest of the developed world now. And just for good measure, it also describes the situation of a fair number of the social sciences. Humanists, the universities that employ us, the disciplines we practice, the graduate programs that we run, and the undergraduate education we provide have been the object of what seems like an unending series of attacks. Book after book, article after article, blog post after blog post repeats the main heads of indictment with a fidelity worthy of a better object. I'll go over them, though many of you know what they are. Humanists are imprisoned within sclerotic, rotting ancient disciplines. We act like specialists as if we were brain surgeons or ear, nose, and throat people, when in fact our disciplines are historically contingent formations that have no particular right to anybody's loyalty. When we write about the things we do in our disciplines, we do so in a meaningless jargon that sounds like water emerging from a very rusty pipe and is equally appealing to the people who try to consume it. We train our graduate students to produce imitative forms of the same kind of jargon, even though, unlike us, most of them won't actually have the chance to train their own graduate students to produce jargon in their turn. As for undergraduates, we don't train them at all, since we have abandoned teaching to adjunct and contingent faculty, lecturers teaching on short-term contracts. And on the rare occasions when we actually do go into a room where we might see an undergraduate, we go about our job in exactly the wrong way. A humanist should be the creator, the impresario of a conversation between bright undergraduates and the great thinkers, the great artists, the great musicians of the past, should create a conversation which is vivid, immediate, and exciting. Instead of that, we bring in a theory and we drop everything we teach through it. It's like a sausage grinder. Whatever you put in, the product that comes out looks exactly the same, and it's just about as inspiring. The fact that we teach this way explains why we've lost all of our students. What it doesn't explain is how we still manage to hoodwink the public and charge vast amounts of money for meeting the few students we have left. If you want to find out how much, the method is very simple. You take the number of classroom hours that a professor teaches, say 6 hours a week, 30 weeks a year, You divide them into a professor's salary. Average salary of a full professor is just over $100,000. And it turns out that the professor is charging about $300 and some a session for this useless knowledge, which will take students absolutely nowhere. So the professor is doing very well. As one of the authors of one of these critiques says, "Say goodbye to Mr. Chips with his tattered tweed jacket. Today's senior professors can afford Mark Jacobs, who of course sells pre-tattered tweed jackets, so you can look like a loony professor." Despite all of this, we continue to lure people into undergraduate courses which are useless in the best case, and in the worst case might distract our poor students from studying something useful and loose them on the world with a degree in, heaven help them, English or religion or some other field which is designed for unemployability. It's a rich protean indictment. I got a religion major. And it appears in lots of places. It's been the theme of a stream of books, some of them by outsiders to the academy in a range of indictments that began in the 1990s with books like Charles Sykes' Prof Scam and Martin Anderson's Imposters in the Temple. Some of them jeremiads by discontented professors who believe in more or less this diagnosis, starting perhaps with Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind and coming down to Mark Taylor's recent Crisis on the Campus. Some of them combine both modes. The recent book by Claudia Dreyfus and Andrew Hacker, Higher Education, ? Is a mixed genre book because she's a reporter and he's a professor. They are married to each other, but nonetheless, it mixes the outside and the inside perspective. Now, all of these books have certain things in common. They're very thin. They don't actually rest on research. Nobody actually goes and looks at, say, 2 or 3 major state university flagship schools, a state liberal arts college, a private liberal arts college, and a private research university. Instead, they browse course titles on the web. Now, every professor here knows that a course title is a little fiction that we float to keep deans and registrars happy. Controlling course titles does not control what we do in the classroom, and reading course titles does not give you any idea of what we're actually going to do in the classroom. But some of the most thoughtful people who've written about current educational problems, Anthony Kronman of the Yale Law School, for example, in a book called Education's End, base their denunciation of humanities teaching entirely on 10 or 15 titles of courses pulled off the web without any information about syllabus, content, much less what actually goes on in the classroom. Anecdotes are recycled endlessly, losing any kind of connection with any fact they might have been connected to in the first place. Often these books come into being purely adventitiously. Mark Taylor wrote an op-ed in the New York Times arguing that we should abandon our outworn departments and create interdisciplinary majors in important subjects like fire. I'm not kidding. This got a lot of attention from people who thought the old earth, air, fire, water cosmology had been abandoned some time ago, at least in natural sciences. So a publishing house, Alfred Knopf, one of the great American publishing houses, came to him and wheedled him into producing an entire book. It's a particularly curious book because Mark Taylor's solution to each of the problems of the humanities is to do what Mark Taylor has done. If humanists are afraid to use digital methods, then create a center where students can teach the timorous humanists how to go onto the web and create new tools. If people in different disciplines don't talk to one another, then create the Mark Taylor Center for Interdisciplinary Conversation, and so on. It's not necessarily that everything he says is wrong, but can you imagine writing a book with a major publisher in which you urge universities to abandon their departmental structure, cut the salaries of professors by 50 to 75%, end tenure, transform the educational system, and do that entirely on the basis of your own experience and a few anecdotes? Yet this is the literature that we face, and it's a literature that matters, I would argue, because its echoes are everywhere. In our public sphere, which reminds me of a fashionable restaurant, You'll all have noticed that restaurants nowadays have tin ceilings so that everything that's said bounces off the ceiling and bounces back and you can't hear yourself think or talk to your dinner partner. Good for awkward dates. I'm not sure what else this actually serves. And our public sphere is kind of one great tin-ceilinged restaurant in which the conversation bangs and bounces around. And it is a conversation that matters. If you talk to university trustees, for example, you often hear echoes of this indictment. Many of our trustees, and I suspect this is true of trustees everywhere, read the Wall Street Journal as their primary newspaper every day. And the Wall Street Journal publishes chapters of this indictment on its editorial page with considerable regularity. It's not good to have authorities hearing only this version of what we do. It's a powerful indictment. It has the punch of a good Philippic. Hacker and Dreyfus say about humanities research, it's useless. Let professors pay for their own vacations in Tuscany. Now, who could answer back to that? It's hydra-headed, cut off one head and 5 more rise, and it really is almost always false in its essentials. I'll just give 3 heads of this indictment. 1, everyone hates professors, particularly humanities professors. You'll find this in every book. We're stuffy, we're arrogant, we're detached from the rest of the world. Well, fortunately, the wonderful Gallup organization has done some polling. And it turns out that people don't hate and despise professors. If you ask a statistical sample of Americans to rate the honesty and ethical standards of various professions, professors come out as high or very high 54% of the time. We do almost as well as dentists, and considerably better than the journalists who write the indictments of us. They come out at 23%, or at bankers who come out in negative numbers these days. Humanists are parasites. Who, asked Mark Yudof in a famous interview, Mark Yudof, the president of the University of California, who will pay the salaries of the English department? After all, the scientists bring in grant money, which pays for them and throws off extra money. Well, Christopher Newfield, a University of California at Santa Barbara faculty member, by close study of the university accounts, has been able to show that actually the humanities divisions of the University of California charge, simply from the tuition income that flows to them for the courses they teach, make a small profit. They are actually subsidizing the scientists who have smaller enrollments, except in very elementary courses, rather than being subsidized by them. And I can give details if anybody's interested. Humanities have lost all their students. Well, actually, no, we haven't. You can do wonders with numbers if you can be allowed to make your own choices about where you start and where you stop. So if you start in 1966, you can say, look at these poor humanists. They had 17 or 18% of majors then, and now they only have 8 or 9. But the fact is, we only had 8 or 9 in the 50s. The 60s represented a blip in which the humanities attracted far more students than ever before. And actually, since the 1980s, when we did go way down, we've had a steady 8 or 9% of students ever since. The humanities were the 3rd most popular major in the 60s. They're the 4th most popular set of majors right now. So in fact, we haven't lost all of our students. Even foreign languages, and God, heaven knows we don't teach and take seriously foreign languages as we should. Every foreign language taught in the United States except Biblical Hebrew has seen a rise in its enrollments in the last 10 years. I can't explain what's happening with Biblical Hebrew. So I could say all is well and flights of angels are singing us to our rest in heaven, but that would be silly. It's obvious that this indictment doesn't come from nowhere. It comes in the first place, I think, from the larger situation of universities, both in the United States and elsewhere, in an English-speaking world which is more and more international and more speaks a common intellectual language. And there's good evidence for thinking that in this wider English-speaking world, some sort of decision has been taken, as a friend of mine who teaches at a state university in New York says, that society actually can't afford to give increasing numbers of Americans or increasing numbers of British people the experience of a traditional campus-based education with the possibility of studying the liberal arts.